In some of my previous videos, I mentioned that we have a great deal of historical evidence which suggests that James, the brother of Jesus, was converted from being a skeptic to being an outright believer. And not just a believer, but the leader within the church who was willing to suffer and die for the cause of Christ. Why is this significant? Because skeptics don't change their mind for no reason whatsoever. Something must have happened that made him change his mind. And I propose that the resurrection of Jesus Christ was the most plausible explanation for this. I covered this in previous videos, feel free to go over them if you wish. Now, some people ask me if I could expand on this topic, like how do we know that James was a skeptic and that he was converted and became a leader? I'll gladly do so. I'll be drawing primarily from the book that I recommended, The Case for the Resurrection of Jesus, by Gary Habermas and Michael Licona. Go and get the book. It is fabulous. Every church should have a copy. Every pastor should read it. Every Bible study leader should read it. It's that good. I'll also add a few additional comments and say a little bit about another brother of Jesus, a fellow by the name of Jude. Now, first of all, how do we know that James was a skeptic? Well, first, we have good reason to believe that all of the brothers of Jesus were skeptics. These brothers are mentioned in Matthew chapter 13, verse 55, where Jesus was teaching in the synagogue, and people marveled at his wisdom, and they asked themselves, is this not the carpenter's son? Is his mother not Mary? Are his brothers not James and Joseph and Simon and Judas? By the way, those are all very common names, so don't be confused. The James spoken of here is not the same as either of the two Jameses in the Apostles. Joseph, that's another word for Joseph, not at all uncommon. Simon, of course, here is not the same as Simon Peter, and Judas is not the same as Judas Iscariot. These are all separate individuals, and that's abundantly clear if you read the accounts of the apostles themselves. So, how do we know that they were skeptics? Well, because the Gospel of John records it. Now, some of you might be saying, wait a minute, you're assuming the Bible to be true. You can't use that. That's circular reasoning. Actually, no. For the sake of this argument, I'm not assuming it to be true. I'm using a principle known as the principle of embarrassment. Here's how that works. Historians acknowledge that when an author admits something that is potentially damaging to his cause or severely damaging to his cause, then it's most likely to be true. In other words, ancient writers or even modern writers are not likely to admit something that's embarrassing for no reason whatsoever. For example, if someone admits that he was a rapist or a bank robber, in all likelihood he's telling the truth. And in the absence of good reason to doubt his word, you would pretty much accept that at face value. Now, if someone were just making up accounts of the life of Jesus, they would probably write and say, and Jesus spoke with such power and conviction that people could not help but believe in him, could not help but be swayed by the power of his words. Instead, John recorded that even his own brothers did not believe him. Again, that's in John chapter 7, verse 5. And that is why even skeptical historians, those who do not accept Jesus as the Messiah, acknowledge that James was indeed a skeptic. By the way, this is corroborated by additional evidence. For example, John records that when Jesus was hanging on the cross, he was speaking to Mary and someone referred to as the disciple that Jesus loved, who is generally acknowledged to be John himself. And Jesus said, Mary, behold your son. Man, behold, and speaking to the disciple Jesus loved, behold your mother. In other words, he was bequeathing Mary's care to this disciple, to John himself. This strongly suggests that Jesus did not want to bequeath Mary's care to his own brothers. Why? Probably because they did not believe him, at the time at least. Again, this is corroborating evidence. Suffice to say that even skeptics acknowledge James started out as a non-believer. Does this bother you? Should it bother you? You know, I'm not troubled by this. And I'm not troubled because of something that Michael Licona pointed out. He once pointed out that if he had a brother who was perfect in every way, who was morally upright and without flaw, he would probably hate the man's guts. You should not be surprised that the brothers of Jesus rejected him. That's what most men would do in such circumstances. So, apart from that, we also have good evidence that suggests that James became a leader within the church. For example, it's recorded by Paul himself in Galatians 1:19. He says that James was one of the apostles. And at various points in the book of Acts, Luke makes comments that suggest that James was indeed a person of great prominence within the church. We know that James died a martyr's death. And the strongest evidence of this is recorded in the writings of Josephus. Josephus was a secular historian. And he recorded that James, the brother of Christ, died a martyr's death for his faith. Now, I mentioned I want to throw in a few additional comments. Some people will jump in and say, wait a minute, we know that Josephus' writings are not to be trusted because there were Christians who interpolated, who kind of tweaked his words, added their own comments, stuff like that. That's why you can't trust that. Those people are confused. Historians often question this one passage in which Josephus makes reference to Jesus Christ himself. That passage is known as the Testimonium Flavianum, or which is Latin for the testimony of Flavius, Flavius being Flavius Josephus. The authenticity of that passage is sometimes questioned. Some people believe that it was tweaked by church scribes. Others say that maybe Josephus was being sarcastic. It's not at all clear whether it was an interpolation or not. But at any point, it's all irrelevant, because I'm not talking about that passage. I'm talking about a separate passage that is acknowledged to have genuinely been written by the pen of Josephus himself. Because of all these reasons, even skeptical historians, those who do not bow their knee at Christ, acknowledge that James was converted. I mentioned a study performed by Gary Habermas, where he surveyed literature in English, French, and German, seeing which points they would all agree on. The scholars who had studied New Testament documents all agreed on. And even amongst the most liberal scholars, virtually all of them, if not all of them, acknowledged that James was indeed converted to being a disciple of Christ. Here's another comment that I want to interject. Some people would ask, wait a minute, I'm Catholic and I don't believe Jesus had any brothers. When the Bible speaks about Jesus having brothers, it just means that they're close relatives, cousins. I don't agree with that interpretation, but it's beside the point. See, whether they were brothers or not, they were still close relatives. The point remains that you had a close relative of Jesus Christ who is in a very good position to examine his life, who rejected Jesus as the Messiah at first, and whose mind was converted to the point where he was willing to suffer and die for the faith. Why was he willing to suffer and die for the faith? Well, I think that 1 Corinthians chapter 15 provides a good explanation. It records that Jesus appeared to various people, including James and the apostles. A personal appearance by Jesus would seem to be pretty strong, a pretty darn good reason to change your mind. A personal appearance of the risen Jesus, that is, would be pretty convincing evidence. I mentioned that I want to talk about one other brother of Jesus. It's a fellow by the name of Jude. Hey Jude, why did you change your mind? Well, I think we have good reason to believe that Jude did change his mind regarding the messiahship of Jesus Christ. And the evidence is not as strong because history does not record as much about it. But I think we have good reason to believe that the Epistle of Jude, rather, was written by the brother of Jesus Christ. Remember the brothers' names. They were James and Joseph and Simon and Judas. Jude being a variant of Judas. Again, don't confuse him with Judas Iscariot, not the same person. Interestingly enough, in the very first verse in Jude chapter 1, verse 1, he introduces himself as the brother of James. Who was this James? In all likelihood, it was James, the brother of Jesus. Because at that point, James was a very well-known person within the church. He was routinely referred to as a leader within the church. It certainly was not James, the brother of John, because Jude would probably introduce himself as James, the brother of James and John. Why did Jude describe himself as the brother of James and not the brother of Jesus? In all likelihood, he did not feel worthy to attach that description to himself. And I don't blame him. So there you have it. We have excellent reason to believe that James was converted. We have good reason to believe that Jude was converted as well. Again, speaking on purely historical grounds. And you don't have to be someone who accepts the Bible as God's word to believe this. Many people who reject it as God's words still acknowledge this to be true. In fact, among scholars who specialize in this field, it's pretty much universally acknowledged. The evidence is there.